Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our safety investigator hats to walk through the absolutely tragic loss of the SS El Faro. Now, this wasn't just some single freak event. No, it was a perfect storm, literally and figuratively, of systemic failures. When we look at a tragedy of this magnitude, where a modern American cargo vessel is lost with all 33 souls on board, we have to look way past just the weather. We need to dig into the machinery, the human psychology, and the corporate oversight that put them directly in harm's way.
Here's how we're going to break down this investigation. 1. Into the eye of Joaquin. 2. Timeline of a flooding disaster. 3. Limits of critical machinery. 4. Failures in company oversight. And finally, 5. Gaps in maritime regulations.
Let's kick things off with Part 1, Into the Eye of Joaquin.
So early on in the voyage, the captain's decision-making essentially locked the ship into a direct, unavoidable collision course with Hurricane Joaquin. He had this established mental model, right? He firmly believed the storm was going to track north and that the El Faro would easily just slip right behind it. And honestly, even as the weather got progressively worse, he just flat out refused to alter that original passage plan. He missed some absolutely crucial opportunities to take safer alternate routes through the Bahama channels.
And what's truly alarming here is how the captain fatally relied on terribly outdated weather software, all while completely ignoring highly accurate, real-time data that was arriving right there on the bridge. The ship was actually getting these SAT-C text advisories from the National Hurricane Center, accurately plotting exactly where the storm was and how intense it was getting. But he favored this graphical software program called BVS. The problem? Because of how those files were downloaded, the data he was staring at was up to 12 hours old. He was literally navigating a massive hurricane using yesterday's weather map.
The voyage data recorder actually captured him saying, "We are gonna be fine," not should be, "we are gonna be fine." This exposes a huge critical vulnerability, the captain's own cognitive bias and his normalization of risk. You see, he'd sailed in the brutal conditions of Alaska and the North Atlantic. He'd survived rough seas before. So this led to massive confirmation bias. He was only accepting information that confirmed what he already wanted to believe, that they were safe. And he completely minimized the hurricane threat, brushing it off as just a low.
Because they sailed right into the teeth of the storm, those hurricane-force winds created what's called a severe wind heel. Now, this isn't just a ship rolling back and forth. No, this is a continuous, punishing lean. The vessel is pushed over by the sheer, prolonged force of the wind pressing against its side, and it just stays there. This extreme wind heel severely compromised the ship's stability, setting the stage for the catastrophic mechanical failures that came next.
Which brings us to Part 2, Timeline of a Flooding Disaster.
Our investigation uncovered a frankly horrifying cascade of events over the vessel's final 2 hours. At 5:43 a.m., the bridge gets notified of an open scuttle and actual flooding. Just 30 minutes later, they completely lose their main engine. At 7:14 a.m., the emergency fire main ruptures, which just accelerates the flooding exponentially. And by 7:39 a.m., the voyage data recorder stops. The ship is gone. It took a mere 2 hours for a massive 790-foot cargo ship to be completely overwhelmed.
So how does a breach like this happen? Well, water started pouring through an open, unsecured scuttle, basically a hatch, on the second deck, and it flowed directly down into cargo hold 3. Once that deck got wet, the friction holding the cargo in place completely vanished. Heavy vehicles literally broke free of their lashings. As the ship is rolling violently in the storm, these loose vehicles are smashing around the hold, and they end up violently severing the ship's emergency fireman, which tragically was completely unprotected from any kind of impact.
With that fire main ruptured, you now have a massive 6-inch pipe wide open to the sea, blasting water in under immense pressure. The rate of flooding was so fast, it rapidly exceeded what the ship's bilge pumps were ever designed to handle. And then, at 6:13 a.m., the captain says, "I think we just lost the plant." It's a haunting recording, and it marks the exact moment the ship became totally disabled. That severe flooding, combined with the extreme lean of the ship, had completely taken out their engine.
Let's look closer at that in Part 3, Limits of Critical Machinery. 15 degrees. That is the maximum static list angle the main engine was ever designed to operate at. If the ship leans beyond 15 degrees for any sustained period, that critical machinery simply cannot function. It was a hard, absolute operational limitation. And the real tragedy here? Our investigation found that the crew was totally in the dark about it. They had absolutely no idea that trying to balance the ship in that storm could actually kill their own engine.
When we meticulously break down the mechanics, we see a truly fatal sequence of events. The captain executed an intentional turn, trying to correct that severe starboard wind heel we talked about earlier. But doing this created a massive 18-degree port list. Because of that extreme angle, the lube oil physically shifted in the engine's sump. The bell-mouth suction pipe, which happens to be offset to the starboard side, rose completely above the oil line and just sucked in air. Immediately, an automatic protective switch tripped to keep the engine from destroying itself, which instantly killed all propulsion.
Without propulsion, the El Faro was completely paralyzed. Radar data proved the ship was essentially just dead in the water. While her bow was pointed northwest, her actual movement over the ground was being pushed southwest at 6.7 knots. They were totally at the mercy of the hurricane at this point, drifting sideways as massive waves pounded their exposed side and flooded right into their ventilation shafts.
Now, let's zoom out a bit for part 4. Failures in company oversight.
One of the most glaring system-wide failures we found was the absolute absence of bridge resource management, or BRM. Now, this is a really vital safety concept adopted from the aviation industry, and it's designed specifically to empower junior officers to assertively speak up and communicate their concerns to the captain. During the night, 2 different junior officers actually suggested route changes to avoid the eye of the storm. But because the company had never properly implemented BRM training, that safety culture just wasn't there. So the captain very easily just dismissed their completely valid concerns.
When you look at the company oversight, it is incredibly clear that shoreside management provided basically zero support or heavy weather guidance to a ship sailing right into a hurricane. I mean, the company's safety management system didn't even have basic heavy weather risk assessments. They hadn't trained the crew on the damage stability software. They even let the ship sail with a broken NEMA motor. The crew literally couldn't even measure the wind speed. On top of all that, nobody back at the corporate office was even tracking the ship's position relative to the storm.
We absolutely must remember that these system-wide failures ultimately cost 33 lives. The lack of shoreside oversight, the total failure to train the crew, the mechanical vulnerabilities, it all converged right here. It was all captured in one of the final, heartbreaking moments on the recording, at 7:38 a.m., as an able seaman simply says, "Going down," realizing the ship is plunging beneath the surface.
Finally, we need to address Part 5, Gaps in Maritime Regulations.
Because the El Faro was an older, heavily modified vessel built way back in the 1970s, she was legally grandfathered past modern stability requirements. This is a massive regulatory blind spot. It meant she was perfectly legal to sail without a class-approved damage control plan. So, when the flooding started, the captain had zero blueprints or booklets to consult to figure out how to isolate that water. Worse still, her life-saving appliances were severely outdated. Instead of the modern enclosed lifeboats required on newer ships, she relied on old, open lifeboats that were basically impossible to launch given the extreme leaning and hurricane conditions.
As an investigator, the big takeaway I want you to get from this explainer is something we call the Swiss cheese model of disaster. Imagine multiple slices of Swiss cheese lined up side by side. Each slice represents a layer of defense: the company, the captain, the machinery, the regulators. Now, every slice has holes in it, representing flaws or failures. Usually, a hole in one slice is blocked by the solid part of the next slice. But on October 1st, 2015, every single hole aligned perfectly. The human error, the mechanical limits, the organizational complacency, it all lined up perfectly to let this tragedy happen. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question about the safety of the entire maritime industry going forward. If a modern American cargo vessel can be lost with all hands simply because older ships are somehow exempt from the very safety rules we know for a fact save lives, are the regulations protecting today's mariners truly watertight? Thank you so much for joining me today, and I genuinely hope this investigation helps ensure a tragedy like this never, ever happens again.